Hey everyone. So Dr. Kerns is originally from Colorado and a former member of the IPCAS board. While attending the University of Colorado as an undergraduate, he undertook a double major in anthropology and history, graduating cum laude. After finishing his undergraduate, he went on to complete 2 master's degrees, one from the University of Manchester in Neolithic archaeology, and the other from the University of Bristol in landscape archaeology. He recently received his doctorate from the University of Southampton. His doctoral research focused on the histories of archaeological inquiry into the Orcadian Neolithic since World War II. Beyond his doctoral research, he has 15 years experience in commercial archaeology in the USA and Canada. He has also directed excavations at an Iron Age cave site in the Mendip Hills, south of Bristol, England, and has participated in several excavations at Neolithic sites in England and Scotland, including Stonehenge and the Ness of Brodgar. Dr. Kerns' research interests go beyond disciplinary histories and include the transition to agricultural lifeways, prehistoric land use patterns, mapping soil preservation characteristics, and the application of new technologies to archaeological investigations. He currently works remotely for Timmins Martell Heritage Consultants as a report writer and will be moving to London, Ontario in 2021. Welcome, Dr. Kerns.
Insert clapping.
Thank you very much, Brittany. Hopefully everything's working and you can see my screen at this point. So
looks good.
Should be all ready to go. So tonight's topic is the Orcadian Neolithic, or how Orcadian archaeologists changed history. It's a pretty bold title. I maybe should have said, did Orcadian archaeologists change archaeology? By the end of tonight's talk, I hope everyone can take some of these objectives away. This talk is really an overview of a number of topics within Orcadian Neolithic archaeology, and many of the slides could have a whole paper or talk given on the topic. By the end, I hope that you, the audience, will be able to answer whether or not Orcadian archaeologists changed archaeology. The outline tonight is, I've given this topic a different version of this talk once before, but I have changed the structure of how I am presenting the information in it. Hopefully it works. I'm hoping we'll be able to follow several different threads through time and see how much they all get knotted and twisted together. I probably spent too much time on the early periods and not enough time on the more recent history, but I not only find the early history fascinating, but really useful in understanding how we got there. Okay, where is Orkney? Orkney is off the northeast coast of Scotland here. It consists of approximately 70 isles, homes, and skerries, 14 of which are inhabited. Orkney covers an area approximately 1/3 larger than Boulder County, but at only half the total land area. The rest is water. Separated from mainland Scotland by a stretch of water known as the Pentland Firth. The name of this stretch of water is most likely derived from Pixland Firth, because the etymology of Pentland, meaning enclosed land, doesn't make sense for Orkney, but Pixland does. North of Orkney is where the North Sea and the Atlantic meet at a point known as the Boreost, and the part of mainland that it's closest to is called Caithness. Situated at 59 degrees north, equivalent to Glacier Bay National Park in Alaska, the northerly location of Orkney is responsible for its acute seasonal variation in daylight hours. During the summer, there is between 2 to 4 hours of darkness, and during the winter, 2 to 4 hours of sunlight. That far north, one would think that Orkney would be bitterly cold. However, the climate is moderated by the warm North Atlantic current. The same ocean current sometimes transports driftwood, such as spruce and pine, from Canada to the shores of Orkney. The range of temperatures, daily, monthly, and annually, is small. The average low in February is 35 degrees Fahrenheit, while in August it's 49 degrees Fahrenheit. The average highs are 42 degrees Fahrenheit in January and 60 degrees Fahrenheit in August. It's pretty chilly on some level, but doesn't change much year-round. Gale force winds, which are winds over 63 kilometers per hour, occur 35% of the time. The average annual rainfall is between 31 and 39 inches. The underlying geology of Orkney consists almost entirely of Devonian flagstones and sandstones, which some with some small formations of lavas, tuffs, and igneous dikes. Surface sediments are generally boulder clay, peat, or Aeolian sand deposits. The first peat likely began forming in the Bronze Age. The topography of Orkney was shaped by glaciation, forming stepped hillsides and leaving behind glacial till soils and clays. Today, Orkney is nearly treeless, and until recently, it was thought to have been treeless in the Neolithic. Recent research has demonstrated that there was at least some woodland during the Neolithic. The area between the island of Mainland and Hoy is Scapa Flow. Scapa Flow was home to the Allied North Atlantic Fleet during World War II. It is essentially a giant natural harbor. I've been speaking about Orkney as a group of islands, but within our society, islands have become a metaphor for both isolation and exotic, and Orkney is definitely not either of those things per se, rather than simply a physiographic categorization. Instead, the notion of an island has become an idea and an ideal that incorporates problematic meanings and perceptions. Consequently, it is difficult to discuss the archaeology of an island group without first acknowledging that these problematic perceptions can, and often do, influence our interpretations. So what is the Neolithic for Orkney? It is the period when agricultural practices were adopted and marks a shift away from a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer lifestyle to a more agrarian society living in more permanent settlements. A more recent description of the Neolithic is represented by this quote from Julian Thomas. Essentially, the term is highly variable, versatile, and contextual, meaning that it can represent a lot of different things to different people depending on the context. Agricultural processes didn't just appear out of nowhere in Orkney. Agricultural processes spread across Europe from the Middle East over the period of thousands of years. The mechanisms behind this spread and its eventual introduction into the UK and Scotland are still matters of often intense debate, although recent genetic research is answering some of these lingering questions. I should say here, if you haven't taken the time to check out the Rhind lectures presented by the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, it is totally worth watching them. There's 7 of them, I think, from this year. They were released back in December. They're all on YouTube from the Society. They're free to watch, and they are brilliant. If you're interested in anything I talk about tonight, it's worth checking them out. They were extremely well done. The sites discussed in Orkney are a local manifestation of a larger regional Western European Atlantic facade Neolithic monument tradition. When I say part of a monument tradition, I mean there are thousands of Neolithic sites that are part of this tradition. In Orkney alone, there are around 100 chambered tombs, several hinges and stone circles, at least 50 standing stones, and at least 24 Neolithic settlement locations. The monument tradition extended from Spain and Portugal all the way to Orkney, with some similarities recorded from Scandinavia as well. Pictured here are just a couple exceptional examples, including the passage grave of Gavrini, which is here on the bottom left. Lahoke B on the island of Guernsey. This is a chambered tomb that had a church built on it in the 15th century, and they didn't know there was a chambered tomb underneath it. Stonehenge on the Salisbury Plain, and Newgrange, Knowth and Douth, part of the Bóinne Complex in Ireland, also a World Heritage Site. And these are a couple examples in Orkney. Maze Howe, probably the best known example in Orkney, and the Ring of Brodgar stone circle. So where to start? Well, the most popular common pop culture reference to Orkney essentially derives from Geoffrey of Monmouth's King Lot of Orkney in his Histories of the Kings of Britain. While Geoffrey of Monmouth doesn't discuss any Orcadian monuments, an account of the Orkneyinga saga does. In the 13th century, Norse scholars began to compile histories of the Norse kings in the form of sagas. The Orkneyinga saga recounts the history of the lords of Orkney from the 9th through the 13th centuries. Both the saga and the Historia Regum Britanniae, the Latin name for Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, and I apologize, I'm horrible at pronouncing all of these, are reflections of broader social concerns surrounding identity and nationalism in the 12th and 13th century. These narratives were produced as a way to support, legitimize, and justify the ruling elite and social order of the time, by linking the history of both British and Norse kings to mythical founding figures who were refugees from the Trojan War. These historical narratives provided an origin myth, mediated the paradoxical superimpositions of colonial and colonized moments, and formed the foundation of a national identity for both regions. For Britain, the narrative meant that the ancient people of the island were perceived to be civilized and noble, but ignorant of God and Christianity. The first major chronicler to reject the historicity of Geoffrey of Monmouth's account was a man named Polydore Virgil. Virgil was retained by Henry VII to write a history of England at the beginning of the 16th century. Virgil represents the beginning of a shift towards a more scientific and enlightened approach to the past. Following the success of Virgil's history, Henry VIII appointed John Leland to the newly created position of King's Antiquary in 1533. As the King's Antiquary, Leland traveled England and Wales, recording extant historic and prehistoric remains, objects of antiquarian interest, as well as place names and genealogies. One of England's most important early antiquarians of the period was Leland's intellectual successor, William Camden. Camden not only helped found the first, but short-lived antiquarian society in England, but he also produced his own work on British history and topography. His book Britannia was published in 1586. Britannia went through several major updates and revisions over the following several centuries, but remained one of the most referenced texts in British history during that time. While the work of Leland and Camden had a lasting impact on the study of history and reflected an incipient systematic inquiry into the past through material remains, their studies nonetheless incorporated little excavation, lacked chronology, and relied on classical accounts to explain prehistoric monuments. For example, in the earliest editions and English translations of Britannia, Camden relied on the classical descriptions provided by Pliny, Ptolemy, Silenus, Nennius, Tacitus, and Pythius to produce a brief narrative of Orkney that made no mention of any Orcadian antiquities. In editions of Britannia published after 1695, the section on Orkney was supplemented with material collected locally and acquired by the publisher. Thanks in part to these 16th century antiquaries, the cultural identity represented by Geoffrey of Monmouth's chronicle was gradually replaced by an emphasis on the Saxons as the progenitors of the British people. This change allowed the ancient inhabitants of Britain and their descendants in Wales, Ireland, and Scotland to be associated with the barbarism and savagery described in classical texts. The change in discourse about the ancient inhabitants of Britain is exemplified in the drawings of Picts and their neighbors by John White, included in Thomas Harriot's A Brief and True Report of the Newfound Land of Virginia. The accompanying text draws a direct comparison between the ancient inhabitants of Britain and the indigenous people of Virginia, stating that the images are for to show how that the inhabitants of the Great Britain have been in times past as savage as those of Virginia, which demonstrates how colonial discourse applied to the New World also became associated with the aboriginal inhabitants of Britain. The influence of this lingered and later emerged through the ways in which British prehistorians engaged with the material past and produced discourse throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the Enlightenment and colonialism were in dialogue with each other. Many of the ideas of the Enlightenment were inspired through interactions with different cultures and different ways of understanding the world. Archaeology as a discipline is a product of the Enlightenment as well as a partner in the colonial endeavor. Due to its location at the northern tip of Britain, Orkney was frequently the final stop before transatlantic voyages that took the northern route to North America. Of particular interest, the Hudson Bay Company recruited heavily from Orkney and had a major dock in Stromness. In 1799, of the 530 men working for the Hudson's Bay Company in North America, 416 were from Orkney. This means that the men who were encountering indigenous North Americans were likely also familiar with the sites and objects associated with the Orcadian Neolithic. Similarly, these men are likely some of the first to bring indigenous North American artifacts back to Orkney. The consequences of these interactions should be explored further and have not yet been done. That has not yet happened. Why do these changing perceptions or even classical or historical accounts matter for understanding the Orcadian Neolithic? Well, antiquarians and early archaeologists use classical and early historic sources to interpret the material remains they encountered in Orkney and beyond. Not only did antiquarians and early archaeologists use these sources to interpret the material they encountered, but they also attempted to fit their interpretations into existing frameworks of reference established by these sources. This practice continued well into the 20th century, with many prominent archaeologists captivated by the allure of investigating the truth of historical sources, including those listed here: Stuart Piggott, who will show up later, O.G.S. Crawford, who is famous in Britain, probably not so much over here, and Sir Mortimer Wheeler. All were fascinated by Monmouth and Arthurian legend, and it led to them participating in archaeological searches for them. Consequently, their interpretations were biased and included notions such as Orkney only being inhabited by the Picts and the Norse, a notion that Orkney was as treeless as it in the past as it is today. They expected evidence of conflict and warfare because the Picts were considered formidable warriors who were only ever temporarily conquered. They expected evidence of the Romans visiting Orkney, but no such evidence has ever existed. And finally, they expected that the main food source in the past was fish because the islands were initially considered unsuitable for agricultural endeavors. One of the earliest accounts of Orkney's Neolithic sites and monuments is a brief manuscript authored by the mysterious figure Joe Ben, and questionably dated to 1529. This text was essentially unknown until Latin versions of the manuscript began being printed at the beginning of the 19th century. The description of the Dorfi stone here on the top left, and well, actually both the two left ones, on the island of Hoy and its accompanying folktale included in the manuscript has garnered the majority of interest from both archaeologists and the public. The tale described how the Dorfi stone was constructed by a giant and his wife, and that the stone for blocking the entrance was made by a rival giant to entrap and kill them. The tale itself is reminiscent in both style and content of Norse myths surrounding giants. It is possible that the tale, as relayed through Joe Ben, is a product of Norse colonization of the islands, rather than long-held traditions. A similar tale for the origin of the Dorfi stone is independently described around the turn of the 18th century, at which point several chroniclers described the two Neolithic stone circles known as the Stones of Stennis and the Ring of Bragar. These chroniclers indicate that there are several interpretations for the stone circles: a place where two opposing armies camped, as high places where sacrifices were offered, and as temples dedicated to the sun and the moon. For the standing stones scattered around Orkney, they were generally thought to have been funeral monuments for important individuals or possibly those who had distinguished themselves in battle. Consequently, throughout the 16th, 17th, and the beginning of the 18th centuries, the interpretations of Orkney's material past were often more an observation of how the local community had incorporated the monuments into their contemporary understandings of the world, rather than an analytical approach to investigating the monuments. The Reverend George Lowe was one of the first corresponding members of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, having been elected in July 1781, and likely the first a member of the Society. In 1772, Lowe was the director of Sir Joseph Banks' visit to Orkney, which took place over the course of 10 days in October of that year. Banks was an English naturalist and botanist famous for his participation in an expedition to Newfoundland and Labrador in 1766, as well as accompanying Captain James Cook on his first circumnavigation of the globe from 1768 to 1771. During the brief visit, Banks showed significant interest in Orkney's Neolithic monuments, which seems to have bolstered Lowe's own antiquarian pursuits. Lowe made two tours of Orkney, first in 1774 and again in 1778, which were essentially research trips to make observations on the natural history of the islands. He included some of the antiquities which he observed during his travels. In a letter to George Patton, a founding member of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland and a well-known antiquarian book collector, Lowe discusses the absurdity surrounding some of the local superstitions associated with flint projectile points, known locally as elf shots. Lowe's major contribution to the knowledge and understanding of the Orcadian Neolithic emerges from his descriptions of the ancient modes of burial, which he had observed excavated on several occasions. At the time of his death in 1795, neither Lowe's manuscripts on the natural history of Orkney nor those recording his tours through the islands had been published. Apparently, the Reverend George Barry acquired Lowe's manuscripts on Orcadian flora, as well as a general account of Orkney, which he then published without acknowledging Lowe in his 1805 publication, The History of the Orkney Islands. It seems that Sir Joseph Banks was asked to intervene and prevent Barry from plagiarizing Lowe, but it is unclear whether Banks ever attempted to do so. The account in the Reverend George Barry's The History of the Orkney Islands provides a representation of the dominant discourse regarding Orkney's past that includes both established and novel interpretations of Orcadian antiquities. How many of the novel interpretations should be credited to Lowe remains uncertain. In reiterating the tenets of natural history of man that emerged from the Scottish Enlightenment and through which human history is understood as progressing from savage to the height of civilization, Barry establishes a philosophical framework through which he interprets Orkney's antiquities. Barry specifically compares Pictish society to those observed among Native Americans and people of the South Pacific. Barry attempts to summarize the observed differences between tumuli, standing stones, and Picts houses, which were generally chambered tombs. He recognizes the tumuli and barrows as places of burial, suggesting that burial traditions, as represented by different styles of monument, varied depending on social class. He also notes that there is a difference between the tumuli and the wards in Orkney, which are kind of mounds on top of hills on islands, the latter of which Barry argues were used to convey intelligence readily from one place to another, particularly to spread the alarm in case of the approach of an enemy. Regarding standing stones, Barry dismisses the suggestion that they served as boundary markers between territories or as grave markers, instead preferring to interpret them as memorials of past events. As for the stone circles, Barry suggests that they were intended to serve the double purpose of temples and courts of justice, or places for assembling large bodies of people for various ends. Barry's enduring impact on archaeological knowledge regarding the Orcadian Neolithic should not be underestimated, because many of the ideas he expressed, including those he dismissed, were reinterpreted and recirculated by later archaeologists, including more recently by individuals such as Colin Renfrew, David Fraser, and Tim Phillips. Both George Barry and George Lowe, as Orcadian ministers, contributed to Sir John St. Clair's statistical account of Scotland, published in 21 volumes between 1791 and 1799. The new statistical account was published between 1834 and 1845, and essentially updated Sinclair's original account, which subsequently became known as the Old Statistical Account. The statistical accounts provide vitally important reference sources for Scotland's history, geography, and society, as well as the archaeological monuments. For Orcadian archaeology, the statistical accounts represent moderately successful attempts to produce parish-by-parish inventories of antiquities. Both accounts are incomplete due to the whims of individual contributors. Some contributors were inclined to provide detailed descriptions and interpretations of Orcadian antiquities, while others made no mention of antiquities at all. Overall, the statistical accounts demonstrate the high frequency in which tumuli, standing stones, and pyx houses were encountered throughout Orkney at the time, and help us to understand how much has been lost in the intervening 200 years. Throughout this period, Orcadian scholars were operating within a temporal framework which archaeologist Peter Rowley Conway has termed an ancient history approach to the past. Essentially, the antiquity of man was limited to a biblical framework, and therefore all of history was recorded in some fashion through classical sources. Consequently, all of Orcadian prehistory was understood as either Pictish or Norse, because the depth of human history was still unfathomable to many scholars. The production of knowledge regarding Orkney's past was therefore limited due to the restrictions imposed by the established temporal frameworks of past human antiquity. Despite the limitations associated with an ancient history approach to the past, throughout this period, scholars increasingly employed deductive reasoning in their archaeological observations and inquiries, rather than relying entirely on myths and legends to explain archaeological phenomena. Scholars began to systematically employ ethnographic analogies, comparative analyses, and typological classifications to interpret the material remnants of the past. A brief side note that is important to understand before we get too far into the second half of the 19th century. Some of the archaeologists discussed in this section could be considered racist because of their interest in ethnology and craniology. It is worth noting that philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment in the 18th century produced a concept of social evolution, from savage to civilized, that predated the concept of biological evolution. Darwin's On the Origin of Species wasn't published until 1859. I repeat for emphasis, it was not published until 1859. At that point, archaeologists were initially quick to try to combine both social and biological evolution through scientific studies of human remains. All of this was taking place in a wider context of colonialism and industrialization. The general validity of the three-age system, the Stone Age followed by the Bronze Age followed by the Iron Age, is so ingrained in modern archaeology that it is difficult to imagine the intellectual challenges associated with the adoption of such temporal frameworks. Scottish archaeologists were introduced to the three-age system of categorizing sites and materials developed by Christian Jurgensen Thompson through the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. Substantial credit should be given to Sir Daniel Wilson, whose archaeological endeavors, while briefly acting as a secretary for the society, ushered in a new framework for understanding the past, prehistory, expressed through the three-age system. Wilson is the one who first introduces the concept of prehistory to a broader English-speaking audience. As a consequence, Wilson had a profound impact on both Scottish and Canadian archaeology. He went on to be the president of the University of Toronto. There are three components that comprise the legacy of Wilson. First, the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland's collections were likely systematically arranged following the three-age system by Daniel Wilson prior to his publication of a synopsis of the Museum of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland in 1849. Immediately prior to his move, Wilson was crucial to the negotiations that conveyed the collections of the Society to the Scottish government, forming the basis for the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland. The second aspect of his legacy is the publication of the Archaeology and Prehistoric Annals of Scotland in 1851. The final part of his legacy is his efforts to establish the regular publication of the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, which became the premier publication for publishing archaeological research in Scotland. The Society's collections eventually formed the basis for the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland. What about Orkney? Well, Daniel Wilson's accomplishments were not completed in isolation. In the preface to his 700-plus page tome on the Prehistoric Annals of Scotland, Wilson acknowledges the contribution of information generously provided by the Society Fellows, Professor Peter Andreas Munch, George Petrie, and Lieutenant F.W.L. Thomas. Based on a letter between Wilson and Munch, it appears that Wilson's view that the stone circles in Orkney were pre-Scandinavian had been influenced by discussions with Munch. Munch visited Orkney with a letter of introduction to a local sheriff clerk and antiquarian, George Petrie, that he had obtained from Wilson during a visit to Edinburgh in 1849. Lieutenant Thomas provided Wilson with detailed measurements and descriptions of the monuments situated around the Brodgar Peninsula, while Petrie provided him with details on Orcadian burial practices, the excavations at Wideford Hill, Chambered Cairn, as well as the first details of objects from the newly revealed dwellings at Skara Brae. Over the course of 21 years, between 1849 and 1870, at least 25 recorded archaeological investigations were undertaken at Neolithic sites, with at least some supervision by a collection of fellows from the Society, including F.W.L. Thomas, George Petrie, James Fair, Robert Hebden, Sir Henry Dryden, and William Trail. The rise in archaeological investigations during this period can be partially attributed to large-scale agricultural improvements following the collapse of the kelp industry in the 1830s. Petrie wrote a letter to Daniel Wilson lamenting the disappearance of perhaps hundreds of archaeological sites without any record of their contents or constructions. Possibly in response to his own concerns for the antiquities of Orkney, Petrie organized and facilitated archaeological investigations throughout the islands, frequently collaborating with James Fair. Fair was not only a fellow of the Society, but he was also a member of Parliament for South Durham, who made regular visits to Orkney to undertake archaeological excavations in pursuit of his antiquarian interests. Fair is not known for having maintained detailed records of his excavations. Fortuitously, many of Fair's excavations were recorded by Petrie. Petrie and Fair also collaborated with Robert Hebden, the owner of the island of Edy, and a Society Fellow. In 1854, Petrie and Hebden investigated the Chambered Cairn at home of Papa Westray North. Their excavation at home of Papa Westray North was the first time a chambered cairn was recognized as sepulchre rather than a pyx house. A year later, Fair visited Hebden and investigated several sites on the home of Edy. These excavations, along with those undertaken at Buchan and Maze Howe, demonstrated to Petrie that the so-called pyx houses are simply chambered tombs, which have been despoiled of their original contents at an early date. Petrie noted that the numerous chambered cairns in Orkney are located, in general, in some prominent place, as the brow of a hill, the seaside, is inlet by the margin of a lake, or other similar locality. Petrie's observations regarding the placement of Orcadian chambered cairns on the landscape are echoed by later archaeologists. Although Petrie made substantial contributions to archaeological understandings regarding Neolithic chambered cairns, he remained stymied by the Neolithic settlement of Skara Brae. The high quality of architecture at Skara Brae, associated with the, quote, rudest forms of flint and stone implements and ceramics, led Petrie to suggest a model of devolution in which the inhabitants of Skara Brae had been, quote, been in a higher state of civilization, and that it was simply that they were compelled by sheer necessity to make use of the only material attainable in their isolated position. Models conceptually similar to Petrie's devolutionist interpretation of Skara Brae would be used by later archaeologists such as Stuart Piggott to argue that Maze Howe-style chambered cairns, and as the pinnacle of architectural skill, represented the earliest chambered cairns, while other styles of chambered cairn represented a subsequent loss of knowledge and skill. Like Daniel Wilson, Joseph Anderson left an enduring imprint on Scottish archaeology as well as on the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. Anderson's major contributions are entwined with the various roles he held throughout his archaeological career, including as a field archaeologist, as an assistant secretary and editor of the Society's proceedings, and as an writer and editor more broadly, and as the keeper of the National Museum of Antiquities. In 1860, Anderson took up the post of editor at the John O'Groats Journal in Wick, which is in Caithness, which is the area of mainland Scotland closest to Orkney. While Anderson was based in Wick, he undertook a substantial number of excavations in and around Caithness, including at 8-chambered tombs. His work was essentially the continuation of work undertaken in the area by Alexander Henry Rind of the Rind Lectures, the one that he basically gave the money that founded the Rind Lectures that go on annually. Anderson was one of the ones who ended up giving them in the 1870s, if I remember correctly. Anderson frequently worked with Rind's collaborators, including Robert Shearer. George Petrie of Orkney assisted in the production of careful ground plans and architectural drawings for Anderson and Shearer's investigation at the Broch of Yarrows in 1867 and the Cairn of Yarrows in 1869. From 1869 to 1913, Anderson was both the keeper of the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland and also the editor of the Society's proceedings. The excavations Anderson undertook in Caithness provided him with the experience and knowledge to begin to classify chambered cairns based on both their internal and external structures. Eventually, Anderson built on the work of George Petrie and began to differentiate between Maze Howe-styled chambered cairns and what are later defined as Orkney Cromarty chambered cairns. Both Anderson's approach to classifying chambered cairns as well as his emphasis on funerary architecture had an enduring impact on how archaeology was conducted in Scotland, as is demonstrated in the similarity between Anderson's approach and the approach taken by Audrey Henschel in the 1950s. Anderson can be credited with the first archaeological use of the phrase "house of the dead" when describing chambered cairns. The concept that chambered cairns may have symbolically referenced Neolithic houses is more recently associated with Ian Hodder and Colin Richards. However, the potential symbolic link between dwelling places and chambered cairns was first explored by Anderson. Essentially, the challenge in identifying chambered cairns whether chambered cairns were burial monuments or dwelling places led Anderson to surmise that the challenge was in fact due to the intent of the builders to mimic places of dwelling. I should note that a bunch of the nice drawings and pictures that you've seen in here, or drawings at least, of monuments were done by George Petrie. His drawings were fantastic. One of the most important Orcadian archaeological inquiries during the later part of the 19th century was the survey and inventory of antiquities by the Ordnance Survey from 1879 to 1880. The Ordnance Survey undertook a detailed mapping of the known Orcadian antiquities as part of their survey of the large-scale plans of Great Britain, the British equivalent of the original U.S. General Land Office survey plats. The practice of mapping antiquities by the Ordnance Survey can be traced to General William Roy, who served on the Military Survey of Scotland in the middle of the 18th century and who became particularly interested in recording the Antonine Wall, a Roman wall north of Hadrian's Wall. Although archaeological remains had been inconsistently recorded on the OS Old Series 1-inch maps produced prior to 1824, the new large-scale plans for Great Britain, the OS generally took a more systematic approach to recording archaeological remains, often in response to pressure from local and national archaeological societies. In Scotland, the imperative to record all remains such as barrows, pillars, circles, and ecclesiastical and other ruins seems to be connected with a request made to the War Department by the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland through their president, the Marquess of Breadalbane, in 1855. Note 1855. At the time, the Society had recently been made aware that many of the primitive monuments of our national history, partly from the progress of agricultural improvements, and in part from neglect and spoliation, were in the course of being removed. Remember back to Petrie's letter to Wilson? It is unclear if Petrie was the only one who informed the Society, but he certainly contributed. The OS, or Ordnance Survey, agreed to comply with the wishes of the Society to record all such historical monuments and requested that the Society endeavor to assist the surveyors with local information through the cooperation of the resident gentry, ministers, schoolmasters, and others. In Orkney, the OS surveyors recorded 125 potential Neolithic sites, nearly half of the possible Neolithic sites known today. The 1879 to 1880 OS survey of Orkney represents the first Orkney-wide and systematic inventory of Orcadian antiquities. Consequently, it can be understood as an advancement in archaeological practice, as well as a major contribution to the understandings of Orkney's past. Archaeological excavations in Orkney after 1870 were infrequent until the 1920s. The reduction of inquiries into the Orcadian's Neolithic seems to coincide with the passing of George Petrie, Robert Hebden, and James Ferrer. Petrie passed away in 1875, Hebden in 1877, and Ferrer in 1879. It is worth noting that during the second half of the 19th century, various antiquarian practices, philosophies, and approaches to understanding the past coalesced into an identical and coherent discipline of archaeology. Although aspects of the discipline existed prior to this time, it was the combination of systematic excavations, detailed records, and an institutional framework for validating knowledge claims that provided the necessary conditions for archaeology to establish itself as a legitimate approach to understanding the past. During this time, the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland acted as a conduit through which most archaeological knowledge regarding the Orcadian Neolithic flowed. Society members such as Daniel Wilson and Joseph Anderson produced and promoted coherent temporal and methodological frameworks that allowed archaeologists to better investigate and interpret the remains of the past. Orcadian Neolithic sites feature prominently in both Wilson's and Anderson's major synthetic works, partially due to the efforts of local society members such as George Petrie and Robert Hebden, who not only initiated archaeological inquiries, but also ensured that the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland was informed of their efforts. During the interwar years, Orkney would once again feature prominently in the influential texts and discourse of the time. During the period between World War I and World War II, British archaeology went through a transformation that included the establishment of archaeological programs within institutions of higher education. Some have considered the establishment of academic archaeology an essential aspect of the professionalization of the discipline that took place during this period. However, archaeology during the interwar years in Scotland, and more specifically Orkney, does not necessarily mirror broader narratives of disciplinary history. Although the establishment of the Abercrombie Chair of Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh in 1927 certainly contributes to the broader narratives, it is not the primary catalyst for the flourishing of archaeological investigations in Orkney. Instead, the flourishing of archaeology in Orkney during this period can primarily be attributed to the delayed impact of the Ancient Monuments Protections Act of 1882. The primary proponent of the act was Sir John Lubbock, frequently remembered for coining and defining the terms Paleolithic and Neolithic in 1865, and his commitment to the notion of unilinear cultural evolution. At the time, Lubbock held substantial standing in both British society and British scientific institutions. Further, Lubbock's archaeological prominence contributed to the passing of the Ancient Monuments Protection Act through his ability to link archaeology, nationalism, and preservationism together. The bill was reintroduced 8 times before finally receiving royal assent in 1882. Despite its shortfalls, the act established 2 important elements of historic preservation as it is practiced in the United Kingdom: a schedule or list of monuments requiring preservation, and an inspectorate of ancient monuments responsible for their acquisition and preservation. The inspectorate reported to the Commissioners of Works and Public Buildings within the Office of Works. The Office of Works originated in the 14th century for the construction and maintenance of Crown property and went through various reconfigurations over time. The schedule or list of monuments for Scotland was prepared by the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, see a theme here, and published in 1880, prior to passing the Act. The schedule included the Ring of Brodgar and the stone pillars at Stennis in Orkney and the neighboring pillars, as well as the chambered mount of Maes Howe. Through the schedule of monuments, landowners could make over monuments into state's guardianship while reserving the freehold to themselves. It is worth noting that the Ring of Brodgar and Stones of Stennis, both included on the initial schedule of monuments, were not actually taken into guardianship until 1906. James Smith Richardson was appointed as an inspector of ancient monuments in the Office of Works Edinburgh branch in 1910. Richardson developed uniform methods and techniques of displaying and conserving monuments, along with the creation of a squad of stonemasons and laborers to undertake these tasks. During the interwar years, 11 Orcadian Neolithic sites were taken into guardianship through the Office of Works, bringing the total number of Orcadian Neolithic sites under guardianship to 16. That represents more than 40% of all sites from all periods in Orkney under guardianship today. During the interwar period, the Royal Commission on Ancient and Historic Monuments Scotland was also active in Orkney. Just like the Royal of the Office of Works, just like the Office of Works, the formation of the Royal Commission is directly tied to the Ancient Monuments Protection Act of 1882. Toward the end of the 19th century, the necessity of a complete archaeological survey was recognized in order to adequately preserve and protect the ancient monuments of Britain. To undertake such a survey or inventory, Gerard Baldwin Brown proposed the appointment of a royal commission on the lines of the Historical Manuscripts Commission, but with powers extending over the wider field of ancient monuments in general. Just as a note, the Royal Commission ended, I believe, in 2016, so they finished and completed their task as a commission just a few years ago. According to Brown, the Royal Commission would first undertake an inventory, and after inventorization would secure to us definitive information as to the artistic and historic treasures we at present possess, would come measures of protection. The Royal Commission on Ancient and Historic Monuments Scotland was established in 1908 in response to the need for an inventory of significant ancient monuments to be compiled in order to better implement the legal protections provided by the Ancient Monuments Protection Act of 1882 and subsequent legislation. When the surveys were begun in Orkney, Shetland in 1828, the staff undertaking the inventory consisted of John Corey as the archaeologist, George Patrick Houston Watson as the principal architect, and Charles Shaw Tyree Calder as a junior architect. Corey began the fieldwork essentially by himself, initially spending over 3 months from June to September undertaking fieldwork. Corey spent an additional 2 months in 1929 and 2 weeks in 1930 completing his field notes on Orkney. Fieldwork for the inventory not only included physically visiting sites, but also included visits to local museums and libraries, along with building connections with local individuals and recording their personal collections. During their surveys of Orkney, the Royal Commission surveyed 177 possible Neolithic sites, including 125 previously identified by the Ordnance Survey. Consequently, when the report was finally published after World War II, approximately 70% of all the known possible Neolithic sites in Orkney had been identified and mapped through surveys and inventories. The information included in the inventory produced by the Royal Commission was supplemented by numerous excavations that took place during the interwar period. The report concluded that the general condition of the monuments is unsatisfactory, and those which are not under the protection of Your Majesty's Office of Works are deteriorating rapidly. However, the report further noted that positive progress being made by Orkney Antiquarian Society and the officers of the Royal Commission in increasing the interest taken in and the respect for their heritage by the people of the islands. The team from the Royal Commission arrived in Orkney the same summer that Gordon Childe began supervising excavations at Skara Brae in 1928. The Neolithic settlement of Skara Brae was placed under guardianship by the Office of Works in 1924. Although a major storm had exposed the site in 1850, little had been done to protect and preserve the site from the encroachment of the sea. Another storm in December 1924 severely damaged House 3. Consequently, the Office of Works spent the summers of 1925 and 1926 constructing a seawall from stone quarried on the site and filled with material excavated from the site. In 1927, the Office of Works began clearing the interior of the structures at the site in preparation for stabilization and preservation. The scale of the conservation activities, along with the lack of archaeological supervision, raised concerns with the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. Some of the concerns seem to have been raised by local Orcadians who were members of the Society. The Society suggested that the newly appointed Abercrombie Chair of Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh, Childe, observed the clearance and stabilization work at Skara Brae. In response, the Office of Works quickly appointed Childe to oversee the archaeological activities at the site, rather than the preservation activities overseen by the Office of Works. Gordon Childe is not only considered by some to be the most influential archaeologist on the Orcadian Neolithic, but is regarded by many as the greatest and most influential archaeological thinker of the first half of the 20th century. It is clear that when Childe arrived in Edinburgh in 1927, as a newly appointed professor of archaeology, he was well versed in the prehistoric archaeology of the Balkans, along with Central and Eastern Europe. But it is also evident that he had limited previous experience with Western European, let alone Scottish, prehistoric archaeology. Further, Childe's excavation experience prior to Skara Brae appears to have been restricted to his short time at the Eastern European site of Kosolowska. I hope I pronounced that right. It's Polish, I'm not sure. Consequently, Childe approached the excavations at Skara Brae from a background in European materials and excavation techniques. In some ways, Childe's experiences at the Neolithic sites of Kosolowska, and Vinca should have helped prepare him for the complicated stratigraphic sequence he encountered at Skara Brae, but he was also hindered by an interpretive framework that relied on diffusionism to explain cultural change, along with entrenched interpretations of the site based on previous excavations. It has been argued that the bulk of the terminology employed to characterize Skara Brae became embedded with the work of Gordon Childe and his subsequent publications. Specifically, rather than dispelling earlier perceptions of the site, Childe's publications actually perpetuated problematic portrayals of the site as subterranean and embedded within a kitchen mitten. Childe's standard of fieldwork at Skara Brae has been amply criticized over the years, while many of his interpretations were not only fiercely debated in the Scottish press at the time, but have since been proven incorrect by further research. Despite his failings, Childe's excavation of Skara Brae remains the fieldwork he is most remembered for. In 1929, James Richardson not only visited Skara Brae during the work there, but he also visited the island of Rousey, where he met with Walter Grant, the major landowner of the island and the director of the Highland Distillers Company Limited, and owner of the Highland Park Whiskey Distillery in Kirkwall, the whiskey I was drinking earlier. At that time, Richardson was directing excavations at Gurness Broch. During the visit to Grant's excavations at Westside, Richardson suggested that Grant should undertake excavations at the Broch of Midhow. Grant's enthusiasm was apparently aroused by the excavations at Skara Brae, may also have been partially stimulated by the efforts of the Royal Commission, who had inventoried Rousey in 1928. Either way, following Richardson's suggestion, Grant began excavations at the Broch of Midhow in 1930. That same summer, Childe was finishing the excavations at Skara Brae, during which he took time to visit the excavations at Midhow Broch, along with the Ministry of Works foreman, Mr. J. Houston, pictured together here with John Graham Callender. Walter Grant was somehow able to enlist the help of John Graham Callender, the keeper of the National Museum of Antiquities in Edinburgh, to provide personal supervision for the excavations at Midhow Broch during the summer months from 1930 to 1933. How Grant was able to enlist the assistance of Callender remains unclear, but Callender's family supposedly produced small batches of whiskey at the time. That autumn, at the meeting of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, Grant was elected as a fellow. J.G. Callender went on to collaborate with Grant on the excavation and publication of 6 Orcadian sites, including the Neolithic chambered cairns at Midhow, now of Yarso, now of Ramsey, and Blackhammer. Collaboration ended with Callender's untimely death in 1938. Besides Callender, Grant had established a regular and capable team to excavate archaeological sites, which included an excellent draftsman in David Wilson, and invaluable skilled labor provided by James Jorson and his son, also a James, but known as Jimmy. After Callender's death, Grant undertook excavations at a number of sites on Rousey. Without the collaboration of Callender, Grant rarely published his excavations. The exception is the Neolithic settlement of Rinyo. The settlement was actually discovered by James Jimmy Yorston during the winter of 1937 to 1938, while actively seeking sites to excavate for Grant. Soon after the discovery of Rinyo, Grant enlisted the expertise of Childe for further excavations at the site. The excavations at Rinyo are also exceptional because they took place both before and immediately after World War II. Grant's contribution to Orcadian archaeology should go beyond considering his enthusiasm and financial support for the excavations on Rousey, but should also include his dedication to both conserving and sharing the sites he excavated. Many of the sites that Grant chose to excavate, he later placed into guardianship with the Office of Works. It would seem that the connections made through that visit by James Richardson in 1929 had an important impact. Childe's focus on European prehistory and his connections to London-based archaeological institutions meant he was somewhat of an outsider when he first took the post of Abercrombie professor. However, the excavations at Skara Brae, immediately after his appointment, quickly immersed Childe in an intricate network of influential individuals and institutions responsible for Scottish archaeology. Even if he was not immediately welcomed by some of his contemporaries, Childe was elected as a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland upon his arrival in Edinburgh in 1927. At the point that Childe was elected a fellow in that year, John Graham Callender was the director of the National Museum of Antiquities and editor of the Society's proceedings, while James Richardson of the Office of Works was the curator for the museum. Childe was understandably considered an outsider when he accepted the professorship, due to his nationality as an Australian, as well as his background in European rather than Scottish archaeology. There have been frequent claims that Childe was shunned by the Scottish archaeological establishment, but that he was certainly not ostracized by everyone. First evidence of The tensions that existed around him and his colleagues emerged from the interpretation and dating of Skara Brae. It is evident in the final report on the excavations at Skara Brae that Child thought that the site dated to the Neolithic, but he hedges his conclusions on the age of the site in what appears to be an attempt to appease or avoid conflict with J.G. Callender. It is unclear whether Child had much choice in his decision to corroborate Callender's own interpretation of the site that it dated from the Iron Age, because at the time Callender was the editor of the proceedings in which it was published, and his own article, ascribing Skara Brae an Iron Age date, was in the same issue of the journal. Child was certainly aware that the secretary of the Orkney Antiquarian Society, Hugh Marwick, had already attributed Skara Brae to a period prior to the Iron Age in his own publication in 1929. The tensions that emerged over the dating of Skara Brae between Child and Callender are further alluded to much later by Stuart Piggott. According to Piggott, in 1936, when he suggested to Child that Skara Brae was Neolithic based on a comparison with pottery recovered from Woodhenge, Child quickly accepted his argument, writing to Piggott, quote, most convincing and guaranteed to make Callender foam at the mouth. Trigger describes Child's failure to definitely ascribe a Neolithic date to Skara Brae as a glaring shortcoming. The sentiment expressed by Trigger is representative of how Child's failure to recognize Skara Brae as Neolithic is often portrayed. Rather than considering it a failure on Child's part to recognize Skara Brae as Neolithic, it may be productive to consider whether or not Child was instead effectively engaging with the contemporary politics associated with practicing archaeology in Scotland during the interwar period. Child's earlier career in politics provided him with useful skills in identifying questions that mattered to people and allowed him to effectively communicate his ideas to a wider audience. Further, Child produced popular text because he genuinely believed that it was his social responsibility to do so in order to disseminate knowledge. After Skara Brae, Child would undertake 3 further excavations in Orkney: Renyo, Coyness, and Maes Howe. After the sudden death of J.G. Callender in 1938, Child was able to participate in the excavations at Renyo at Grant's invitation. Coyness and Maes Howe were the last 2 excavations of Child's career before his untimely death in 1957, and not only demonstrate his fondness for Orkney, but his connection to the then Ministry of Works. At the time, the Ministry of Works was undertaking conservation activities at both chambered tombs in preparation for public display. At the time, the foreman of the Orkney Ministry of Works squad was James Yorston, a former employee of Walter Grant, whom Child had befriended during the excavations at Renyo. That's James Jimmy Yorston. It is also worth noting that Child undertook the excavations at Coyness without a salary from the Ministry of Works. Prior to Child's excavations at Coyness, chambered tombs were not necessarily thought to be from the same cultural group as the settlements at Renyo and Skara Brae. Child was able to change his view, and subsequently other archaeologists' view, after the excavations demonstrated grooved ware pottery was associated with that style of chambered tomb. We move into the post-World War II era, the actual part that was part of my PhD, and not just history, background stuff. In 1951, Child's successor in Edinburgh was Stuart Piggott, and he initiated a project to compile a corpus of Scottish chambered tombs and their contents, which was to be undertaken by Audrey Henschel. From 1952 to 1959, Audrey Henschel carried out surveys of chambered tombs across Scotland, including Orkney, while simultaneously working for Child's former student, RBK Stevenson, at the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland. The project undertaken by Henschel appears to be an extension of Piggott's own research on the classification of Neolithic mortuary monuments in Scotland. With the publication of the Neolithic Cultures of the British Isles in 1954, Piggott produced a typological classification of the chambered tombs of Scotland based on spatial distributions and the aesthetics of architectural features within an intellectual framework reliant on diffusionary and evolutionary explanatory models. In regards to Orkney, Piggott classified all the chambered cairns within a larger Orkney-Cromarty grouping. Piggott's typological classifications briefly replaced the cairn typological classifications established by the Royal Commission. Piggott's classifications were soon modified, adapted, and replaced by with the publication of Henschel's The Chambered Tombs of Scotland, Volume 1. Well, it is clear that Henschel's typology of the Orcadian chambered tombs is derived from Piggott's own typological system. Henschel considers the Maes Howe type tombs separately from the Orkney-Cromarty group, which really separates Henschel's typology from Piggott's, as well as contributing to the longevity and endurance of her scheme, is her approach to engage with material remnants from the Neolithic. Beyond visiting and recording numerous chambered tombs, Henschel also endeavored to examine and draw all the grave goods housed in the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland, including those from previous excavations in Orkney. Henschel's effort to engage with the material recovered from the excavation of chambered tombs in Orkney separates her work from that of other archaeologists and allows for more detailed and nuanced contextual descriptions of the Orcadian chambered tombs. In 1981, Audrey Henschel decided to return to Orkney with the head of the Ordnance Survey Archaeology Division, Scotland, James Davidson, to conduct a new survey of the chambered cairns of Orkney. The primary objective of this survey was to update the material covered previously by revisiting all of the sites included in the original text, as well as visiting any additional sites identified since 1963 by the Ordnance Survey and others as possibly representing Neolithic chambered cairns. After World War II, the wider public quickly became interested in archaeology, due in part to radio and television programs, but also due to the many excavations undertaken after the war in response to wartime damage. Consequently, the public was concerned with the accelerating destruction and damage to archaeological sites after the war. At the time, the Ordnance Survey was considered the only organization capable of quickly responding to the threat through a survey and recording of archaeological sites. This belief consequently led to an expansion and reorganization of the archaeology section of the Ordnance Survey into a larger archaeology division. The Scottish office, based in Edinburgh, opened in October 1958. There, the Archaeology Division was responsible for the revision and improvement of archaeological information, included on new and existing maps. The Archaeology Division also worked closely with the Royal Commission and the Inspectorate of the Ministry of Works, as well as successors, to accommodate the mapping, surveying, and recording needs of Scotland's material past. A new survey of Orcadian sites conducted by the Ordnance Survey began in April 1964 and continued on and off through 1973. During this phase of survey work, the surveyors recorded 216 sites in a total of 121 days on the ground. Moving on to the radiocarbon revolution. The unfortunate death of Child in 1957 is an important historical event because it symbolically represents the end of one temporal understanding of the Orcadian Neolithic and the beginnings of a new way of thinking about it. However, more broadly, the beginning of the shifting temporal understandings of the Neolithic may best be represented by the development of radiocarbon dating in 1949. Reflecting on the impact of radiocarbon dating, Lord Colin Renfrew, pictured top left, has said that it may be the most significant advance in 20th century archaeology. After the end of World War II, Willard Frank Libby, an American chemist, collaborated with other colleagues at the University of Chicago to develop a radiocarbon dating technique. The results of their experiments were published in 1949. The experiments demonstrated that an approximate age of archaeological materials could be established. The first publication of radiocarbon determinations for archaeological material was in September of 1950 within a little-known publication, Southwestern Lore, published by the Colorado Archaeological Society. The editor of Southwestern Lore had obtained a report by the University of Chicago on radiocarbon dating and was able to publish a selection of dates that were thought to be of interest to the members of the society. The full report produced by Arnold and Libby would be published in the journal Science in February of 1951. By 1970, the incorporation of radiocarbon dating into archaeological practice was well established and had already made a dramatic impact on the understanding of the Neolithic. In a review of how radiocarbon dating had contributed to archaeological practices and knowledge production in Britain, Godwin published tables of all the radiocarbon determinations for Neolithic sites in Britain and Ireland. Based on Godwin's tables, there were 110 radiocarbon determinations for 64 possible Neolithic sites in Britain and Ireland. However, there were only 9 determinations for 6 Neolithic sites in Scotland at the time. For comparison, there are now, as of 2019, over 550 radiocarbon determinations for Neolithic sites in Orkney alone. It is within this context that Colin Renfrew began his investigations into the Orcadian Neolithic. Radiocarbon dating had already begun to have a major impact on the broader understanding of the Neolithic, but with Colin Renfrew's investigations in Orkney fundamentally changed the temporal understandings of the Orcadian Neolithic and further contributed to a growing understanding of the Neolithic across Britain and Europe. For Renfrew, the questions raised by radiocarbon chronologies led to researching the processes of social change and social structures during the Neolithic as an alternative to explanatory models based on diffusion. As Renfrew has described it, a good objective chronology does not say what happened in the prehistoric past, only when it happened. It offers no explanations, a mass of well-dated artifacts, monuments, and cultures, yet with no connecting interpretation of how these came about and how culture change took place. According to Renfrew, both Wessex and the Orkneys were good areas to look at those things because of the phenomenal preservation of monuments. According to Mike Parker Pearson, Renfrew's collaboration with John D. Evans led him to appreciate the potential of island settings as laboratories for studying cultural processes. Renfrew states that his primary motivation for his inquiries into the Orcadian Neolithic was to obtain materials suitable for radiocarbon dating. Renfrew provides context for his excavations in Orkney by describing how the calibration curve for radiocarbon dates had made it clear that the monumental collective tombs of Europe were not the product of some colonist movement or wave of diffusion from the Mediterranean world. He further acknowledges that when he began his investigations, that there were no radiocarbon dates for the Neolithic monuments in Orkney, and few radiocarbon dates available for sites across Scotland. However, Renfrew's overarching aim for the project was to investigate not simply the monuments' origins and chronology, but their place and function in the social life of the societies which created them. The change in the understanding of the Orcadian Neolithic that Renfrew brought about through new chronological models is particularly poignant when comparing the perception of Maeshowe prior to and after the introduction of Renfrew's chronological models. Prior to Renfrew, Maeshowe was considered the earliest of the chambered tombs in Orkney, brought to the islands by immigrants from the Boyne Valley in Ireland. After Renfrew's work, Maeshowe became the pinnacle of Neolithic achievement in the islands, the last and greatest in a long line of funerary monuments constructed on the island. The impetus for conducting new excavations at Skara Brae in the 1970s paralleled the motivations for Renfrew's contemporary excavations at Quantum-Ness. There was a desire to obtain materials suitable for radiocarbon dating as well as paleo-environmental data. However, unlike Renfrew's concern over the ramifications of new chronological models derived from radiocarbon dating, the underlying motivation for the Skara Brae excavations was to contextualize the assemblage from Skara Brae obtained by Child's excavations in preparation for a new exhibit then proposed for the Museum of Scotland. Although the underlying motivations differed between Renfrew's project in Orkney and the Skara Brae project, both projects may be considered in line with the epistemological emphasis on knowledge validation as framed by the new archaeology or processualism. According to Stuart Piggott, the excavations at Skara Brae in 1972-73 were the climax of museum and department cooperation, the informal alliance between the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland and the Department of Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh, which was initiated and maintained by the then keeper, Robert Baring Kerr Stevenson. Bonds linking the communities of archaeologists associated with both institutions was, therefore, well established prior to the excavations at Skara Brae. These excavations were led by David V. Clark, then a research assistant at the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland, and Anna Ritchie, then on a temporary lectureship with the University of Edinburgh. The excavations were undertaken with permission and major support from the Department of Environment Ancient Monuments Division, who provided the substantial financial backing and on-site support necessary for the project. An influential social network was forged, maintained, and interwoven through a series of excavations undertaken during the 1970s and 1980s that didn't actually start with Skara Brae. The series of excavations starts with excavations at Buckoy by Anna Ritchie in 1970. A number of people who would follow Anna to work on the excavations at Skara Brae and continued to work with her at Nap of Howard and with her husband Graham at the Stones of Stennis. Some of those workers returned to Skara Brae with Clark in 1977 and continued on with him for the excavations at the Links of Noltland. Members of these excavations then went on to work at Purewall and Point of Cot. Finally, Anna Ritchie returned to excavate the home of Papa Westray North for a second time in the mid-1980s. This network essentially spawned most of the future archaeological inquiries into the Orcadian Neolithic. It also had a lot of influence and control over the production of knowledge regarding the Orcadian Neolithic. There is therefore potential here for bias through self-reinforcing ideas within a coherent group. Members of the excavation communities that coalesced around the excavations of the Orcadian Neolithic had personal histories prior to joining the excavations, and those histories have continued since the excavations. The practice of archaeology forges bonds between individuals through shared purpose and experience. These bonds were also forged through engaging with particular materials and objects that represented the activities of an Orcadian Neolithic community over hundreds of years and several generations. bonding did not only occur between individual archaeologists, but also between archaeologists and the materials representing past activities. These bonds within the context of personal histories are integral to both the practice of archaeology and the production of knowledge. It is the dialogue established between individuals and materials through archaeological practice that produces knowledge. That knowledge emerges within the context of individual, communal, and institutional histories. Those histories form a complex, entangled web of social networks, affiliations, memories, identities, and relationships that become embedded within the knowledge produced through the practice of archaeology. While the communities affiliated with these excavations were only together temporarily, and their identities situational, through the performance of fieldwork, the bonds connecting individuals and materials were established. Similar to any identifiable community, these communities were dynamic, their membership changed, and their identities were renegotiated and transformed through such changes. However, the continuity within the intellectual identity of the community was retained through the renewal of bonds and the continued participation of certain core community members, such as Alexandra Shepherd, in further inquiries into the Orcadian Neolithic. Okay, wait, slide didn't want to change that briefly. Okay, Ian Hodder was made a full lecturer in archaeology the same year that Colin Renfrew was elected to the Disney Professorship of Archaeology at the University of Cambridge in 1981. The two would remain colleagues within the archaeology department in Cambridge for the next 18 years. Ian Hodder published Symbols in Action in 1982. In it, he applied his contextual approach to archaeology, which he advocated for throughout the book, to the archaeological record of the Orcadian Neolithic. While an undergraduate from 1968 to 1971 at the Institute of Archaeology in London, Hodder became steeped in the discourse produced by Child and became fascinated with Child's interpretations of Skara Brae. For Hodder, the unique depositional context, the quality of preservation, and the accessibility of information regarding the internal layout of structures meant that Orcadian Neolithic sites were able to serve as an ideal case study for the application of a contextual approach to archaeology. Beyond Hodder's fascination with Child's interpretations of Skara Brae, he was also stimulated to respond to the research conducted by Colin Renfrew in Orkney. According to Hodder, it was partially his belief that Renfrew's Orcadian research was not contextual that stimulated him to respond to it. After his initial foray into interpreting the Orcadian Neolithic, Hodder closely followed the investigations undertaken by Colin Richards, pictured here in the center, and incorporated them into his own interpretations of how symbolic structures underlay different fields of activity. As Colin Richards' research in Orkney unfolded, Hodder found that his interpretations supported his ideas perhaps better than anywhere else in Europe, thinking that it was odd and ironic that this should happen so far away from Çatalhöyük. Hodder believes that his application of a contextual approach to the archaeology of the Orcadian Neolithic had little enduring impact because he believes his work was too obviously a brief afterthought foray, and that others didn't think it worked very well. However, his analysis of symbolic meanings of the architecture through the work of Colin Richards became embedded in the dominant archaeological interpretations for at least the next several decades. The interpretations produced by Hodder not only influenced, but also telegraphed how the epistemological shift towards a concern with interpretation would be enacted by Colin Richards. So the post-processual bit there. When Colin Richards arrived in Scotland sometime around 1982, he was initially based in the Artifact Research Unit at the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland in Edinburgh. Within the ARU, Richards was initially working with David V. Clark, analyzing the grooved ware ceramics recovered from Links of Noltland. Colin Richards' initial design for his postgraduate research was to examine the grooved ware from Links of Noltland and turned out unviable. According to Neil Sharples, the pottery from Links of Noltland was quite difficult to work with because it was all mashed up. Consequently, Richards redesigned his research project to incorporate more fieldwork. The necessity to redesign his research project allowed Richards to eventually refocus much of the research on the symbolic and practical qualities embodied in Neolithic architecture, with particular attention given to notions of cosmology, classification, and order. Richards' eventual doctoral research project clearly derives from and expands upon the approach advocated by Hodder. Within this context, Colin Richards began a program of survey through systematic field walking in 1984 that led to the identification of the Neolithic village of Barn House, along with several other probable Neolithic sites. The field walking program was aimed at locating and identifying surface scatters of material culture associated with Neolithic settlement activities areas. At the time, all of the known and confirmed Neolithic settlement sites, with the exception of Brynjo, had been exposed through coastal erosion, biasing the Neolithic settlement records towards accidental survival and discovery. Richards wanted to provide a more balanced image of the Neolithic landscape. To accomplish this objective, Richards introduced a more systematic method of identifying settlement activity, field walking. Through his field walking project, Richards identified 9 sites, 6 of which indicated areas of Neolithic settlement. In December of 1984, during field walking in an area north of the Stones of Cenis, Colin Richards' dog Rufus is credited with discovering the Neolithic village site of Barn House. The role of Rufus in the discovery of Barn House is memorialized in the dedication section of his excavation report on the project published as Dwelling Among the Monuments in 2005. The project undertaken by Colin Richards at Barn House raised a number of issues which he desired to investigate further. Richards initiated the Coolleen-Wideford Landscape Project in 1994 with the aim of addressing the issues raised by the investigations at Barn House. The project itself may be broken down into 3 phases of fieldwork. The first phase of fieldwork undertaken seasonally from 1994 to 2000 and included the Stone Hall sites and the site of Crossy Crown. A second phase of the project took place alongside the Great Stone Circles project and included the excavations at Wideford Hill Settlement and Ranbury Head site. A third and final stage of fieldwork included excavations at the settlements of Muckoi and Smirkoi. The Queen Wideford Landscape Project was published in The Development of Neolithic House Societies in 2016. It was combined with research undertaken by Jane Downs on the Orkney Barrows Project, as well as with ongoing fieldwork being conducted by the Orkney Research Center for Archaeology, otherwise known as ORCA. Richard's portrayal of the fieldwork over the course of slightly more than 30 years suggests a cohesive and long-term strategy of research, which is unsupported by the disjointed nature of the fieldwork undertaken during that time. Over the time, the project changed its focus from investigating other late Neolithic settlements in order to provide a contrast to Barn House, to an emphasis on the social processes and strategies that lay behind the extensive changes seen in the materiality and architecture of houses, settlements, and monuments over a 1,500-year period of time. The changing focus of the project was a clear response to questions being raised through further investigation into the Orcadian Neolithic and contributed to the project's expansion over time. If any unifying epistemological principle can be used to describe the most recent period of archaeological inquiry in Orkney, and probably further afield, it can be described as an epistemological shift towards a greater concern for justifying the social relevance of archaeological practices and knowledge production, rather than a concern with how materials are interpreted, or with validating knowledge. Underlying this shift are broader concerns over the concrete benefits of archaeological practices beyond reinforcing disciplinary authority over the production of knowledge or providing a temporal narrative as context for actions in the present. This changing epistemological orientation manifests itself in the governing framework surrounding the discipline of archaeology that influences research objectives and evaluations of project outcomes. Whether it is a public engagement and outreach or addressing complex multidisciplinary issues which require increasing collaboration, such as climate change, these trends in archaeological practice represent an increasing concern with the social relevance of the discipline and its practices. For Orkney, the manifestation of this shift has been entwined with the inscription of the Heart of Neolithic Orkney on the list of World Heritage Sites. Since gaining World Heritage Site status in 1999, very little archaeological research has been undertaken in Orkney, particularly regarding the Orcadian Neolithic, without some consideration of the relationship of the interventions to the management of the World Heritage Site. It has also been suggested that there is a causal link between the establishment of the World Heritage Site and an increased amount of archaeological fieldwork throughout Orkney over the past 20-odd years. The creation of the Heart of Neolithic Orkney World Heritage Site signifies a structural change in how archaeologists approached investigating the Neolithic past in Orkney. Guiding framework that regulates archaeologists' approach to the Orcadian Neolithic was codified in 2005 through the publication of the Heart of Neolithic Orkney World Heritage Site Research Agenda. The research agenda for the Heart of Neolithic Orkney, along with the subsequent Heart of Neolithic Orkney World Heritage Site Research Strategy 2013 to 2018, may be understood as reflecting an idealized approach toward the archaeological practice in Orkney, not only regarding the Neolithic, but all archaeological periods of interest within the islands. Consequently, these documents have not only influenced the practice of archaeology in Orkney, but they have also structured its interpretation and presentation. The significance of the inscription of the Heart of Neolithic Orkney World Heritage Site to the production of knowledge is clearly demonstrated through the cumulative impact the World Heritage Site has had on the volume and variety of archaeological research undertaken since 1999. The creation of the World Heritage Site acted as a catalyst for the development of an institutional infrastructure to support a wide range of archaeological practices. This is demonstrated through the growth and activities associated with both the Orkney College University of Highlands and Islands Archaeology Institute and the Orkney Research Center for Archaeology. The World Heritage Site has also stimulated an agglomeration of individuals and institutions that engage with the Orcadian material past. According to Nick Card, in 1998, there were only 3 archaeologists in Orkney, but by 2017, there were around 30 archaeologists residing on the islands. Further, the inscription of the World Heritage Site not only directly provided additional controls for funding archaeological research, however, the status and prestige did not directly provide additional controls or funding for archaeological research. However, the status and prestige associated with World Heritage Site recognition contributed to the development of opportunities to obtain funding for archaeological research. The growth of archaeological research into the Orcadian past is the result of a cumulative effect of a structured research strategy associated with the management of the World Heritage Site. Radiocarbon determinations for the sites within the World Heritage Site boundaries can serve as a tangible example of the impact of inscription of the World Heritage Site has on archaeological research concerned with the Orcadian Neolithic. Prior to inscription, there were a total of 127 radiocarbon dates obtained for the Orcadian Neolithic sites over the course of 23 years. Since the inscription of the World Heritage Site, there have been 435 radiocarbon determinations obtained for Neolithic sites over the past 20 years. Some of the increase in volume of radiocarbon dates may be explained by reductions in the costs associated with obtaining them. However, there is also a noticeable bias towards obtaining more radiocarbon dates for sites within the World Heritage Site area. Neolithic sites elsewhere in Orkney have had an increase in radiocarbon determinations by a factor of 2.42, while determinations for Neolithic sites within the World Heritage Site area have increased by a factor of 5.69. Presently, there are 35 Orcadian Neolithic sites with radiocarbon dates. However, the 7 Neolithic sites within the World Heritage Site area represent approximately 46% of all the radiocarbon determinations obtained for the Orcadian Neolithic, while only representing 20% of the Neolithic sites with radiocarbon dates. Prior to inscription, there were 20 Neolithic sites with radiocarbon dates, 4 of which would eventually be in the World Heritage Site area, once again representing 20% of the Orcadian Neolithic sites with radiocarbon determinations. Both the overall increase in radiocarbon determinations and the bias towards the sites within the World Heritage Site can be, at least partially, attributed to the inscription of the World Heritage Site. The role of the BBC as a medium for disseminating knowledge and discourse provides context for connections to wider networks of knowledge exchange that communities practicing archaeology participate in. The program Chronicle was executively produced by Paul Johnston, who, according to Anna Ritchie, was very important in influencing television in the direction of archaeology. A pioneering precursor to Time Teen, prior to the excavations at Skara Johnston had produced a program on Anna Ritchie's excavations at Buckoy, as well as working with her on several other programs. Consequently, there was already a rapport built between Johnston and Anna Ritchie that allowed for future collaborations. Initially, the series Chronicle was commissioned by David Attenborough, based on the success of previous programs such as Animal, Vegetable, Mineral, and Buried Treasure, which both featured archaeologists such as Mortimer Wheeler, Glenn Daniel, and Stuart Piggott. Attenborough and Johnston had great ambitions for the Archaeological and Historic unit at BBC. According to Attenborough, the goal was to have a unit which was so well known and respected in archaeological circles that, when an important discovery was made, the first people archaeologists would contact would be the BBC, whether the find was in Wessex or Guatemala. A full examination of the role of the media in the dissemination of archaeological knowledge is well beyond the scope of this talk. However, this anecdote regarding BBC's interest in the excavation at Skara Brae and laterally Nap of Howard, as well as the program Chronicle, serves as to demonstrate how this small group of archaeologists were participating in larger, potentially global systems of archaeological knowledge exchange and contributing to wider distribution of archaeological discourse. Finally, this is the last slide, I promise, for everyone who thinks I've been talking way too long, which I probably have. In Orkney, the response to threat of coastal erosion have been managed through a collaborative effort by a number of institutions and individuals whose entwined histories provide context for their efforts. Since the appointment of the Orkney archaeologist in 1978, this individual has been responsible for identifying threats to the Orcadian material past and implementing mitigating strategies. Funding and support for these mitigation projects have frequently been supplied by, either solely or through a combination of, the Orkney Islands Council, Orkney Heritage Society, the Royal Commission, the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, and the various incarnations of the Office of Works. Together, these institutions represent the major sources of funding for archaeological inquiry into the Orcadian Neolithic. As the major funding sources, these institutions have been able to strongly influence investigatory practices. It is within the context of a growing concern for the preservation of archaeological sites and monuments, along with rapidly changing legal frameworks, that Raymond Lamb began his survey and inventory of Orkney in 1979. Lamb's survey not only created an updated record of the archaeological sites on file with the Orkney Sites and Monuments Record, but they also identified threats to particular sites from coastal erosion for the first time. Lamb's assessment of the threat to sites from coastal erosion provided the impetus for further archaeological projects. On the island of Sandy, for example, the threat of coastal erosion led to archaeological investigations at the Neolithic sites of Poole, Treyness, Stove Bay, and Toftness. A decade after Lamb's surveys ended, a new inventory of threatened coastal sites was undertaken by Hazel Moore and Graham Wilson. Hazel Moore began working in Orkney in 1889 as a field archaeologist for AOC Archaeology Group at the sites of Turquoise and Scar Viking boat burial. Hazel Moore's experience with commercial archaeology in Orkney seems to have sparked her interest in Orkney's past and brought her an awareness of the threat of coastal erosion. Together with Graham Wilson, Moore co-founded Ease Archaeology in the 1990s. Ease Archaeology conducted the coastal zone assessment surveys of Orkney in 1997 to 1999. The surveys were commissioned by the Orkney Archaeological Trust and funded by Historic Scotland. The aim of these surveys was to characterize the built heritage and archaeology of the coastal zone, defined as a 50 to 100 meter wide strip of land adjacent to the coast. In addition, the vulnerability of sites to coastal erosion was also assessed during these surveys. According to Moore, during the period she became increasingly aware of and concerned by the issue of coastal erosion and its effects on archaeological sites in Orkney. In particular, Moore was concerned by a perceived lack of any concerted response to coastal erosion by local or national bodies. Consequently, together with her Ease co-partner, Graham Wilson, Moore devised and raised funds to investigate a number of eroding sites. Since 2005, the current field project being undertaken by Ease Archaeology at the Links of Nolan, 2000 to present, grew out of a program of monitoring work which Ease Archaeology carried out over several years while working on West Strait. Since 2005, the project Rising Tides, Merged Archaeology of Orkney, led by Caroline Wickham-Jones, has been addressing the threat of climate change and coastal erosion through a slightly different survey approach. The project has been investigating past sea level change in the submerged prehistoric landscape of Orkney along the coast, specifically at the Bay of Firth, the coast of Sanday, as well as around the Loch of Stennis. These underwater surveys have not only been investigating the potential survival of archaeological sites on the seabed, but are also aiding in a more detailed reconstruction of the past environment and landscape of Orkney. A better understanding of how sea level rise impacted the preservation of archaeological material in the past aids archaeologists today in better understanding the threat posed by modern sea level change and coastal erosion caused by climate change. The knowledge produced by this underwater survey project may be incorporated into future mitigation strategies as well as help dictate future research priorities, not just in Orkney, but further afield as well. Archaeology is perpetually endangered by both human actions and environmental factors. The recognition of threats to the material past led to the implementation of legislative frameworks and public policies that have often encoded the contradictory cultural values associated with identifying, investigating, and preserving the material past. Orcadian archaeologists have responded to the threats posed by coastal erosion by implementing survey and monitoring programs. These survey and monitoring programs have not only been an inspiration within Scottish archaeology, but worldwide as well. With more recently, Orkney is once again serving as a model for the development of programs aimed at assessing environmental threats to the material past. In April 2019, leading climate change scientists and heritage professionals from around the world gathered in Orkney as part of a workshop associated with a pilot program that is developing a new methodology to assess the risks of climate change to heritage sites. The Climate Change Vulnerability Index, CVI, is a methodological approach that aims to rapidly assess the risks to heritage sites from phenomena such as rising sea levels and higher temperatures. The Heart of Neolithic Orkney was chosen by ICOMOS, Climate Change and Heritage Working Group, to be the first site to be assessed using this new methodological approach. Histories of archaeological practice in Orkney have verified the effectiveness of structured survey and monitoring programs for identifying, investigating, and preserving the material past. It is also clear that similar programs could be beneficial in other areas across the globe. Effectively implementing such programs further afield may require a deeper understanding of local values surrounding the material past, along with an understanding of how such programs emerged in other contexts. Therefore, further research investigating local history surrounding heritage management may be useful insight that can aid in the implementation of policies and programs. I will end it there and thank all of the people, including Allison, who's hiding in the corner behind me, and all my supervisors and the examiners and all the people I interviewed who did archaeological research in Orkney were wonderful, and came back and edited stuff and gave me feedback all the time. My friends who went on adventures in Orkney with me, to Kay, who did some of the mapping for me and helped me with the mapping for this, and some people getting me in touch with the right people to do this. And I look forward to questions. I hear a Christian.
Looks like I saw Gretchen raise her hand. Gretchen, would you like to?
Yeah, I have a question. Can you hear me?
I can hear you a little bit, Gretchen.
Okay. So is there somebody who's written a really good report on the relationships between the different sites on Orkney?
In what way are you looking for relationships between the different
like,
sites?
Because when I was on Orkney, it's like you can see from one site to the there's line of sight.
Yes, yes, there is line of sight between a bunch of the sites in Orkney.
Yeah, and has somebody done research on that? And if so, did they write it up? And is it legible?
I did actually. I wrote that for my landscape masters from at the University of Bristol. So I did write that up. There's a couple others people who have written stuff about it. Vicky Cummings and Amelia Pennant have an article in chapter in a book in an edited volume that I have. Tim Phillips has written one. I mean, probably the best kind of looking at intervisibility and some of that stuff still goes back to David Fraser, who wrote his PhD on Orkney in 1982. He finished it. He wrote it up in 3 years, and it's probably the best piece of research on Orkney ever produced as a single piece of research. That one is he later published his PhD, and that one's available. I have that as a PDF as well if you need it at some point. But I have several things that do cover that. But my MPhil also covers kind of some of that relationship between those sites. So hopefully that answers it a little bit.
Yeah.
Do you have any specific questions about that relationship? Because I should be able to answer any particular relationship you want to know more about.
That was the thing that intrigued me when I was there, was that these things must be related. I mean, just from standing there in the rain and the wind.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the big conclusions that came out of my MPhil was that the settlement sites were located in areas where they were visible from chambered tombs.
Yeah.
Not necessarily the other way around, but that they were visible from the chambered tombs. And that was not by chance. They specifically, the chambered tombs predate most of the settlements. So in terms of dating them, most of the chambered tombs in Orkney are older than the settlement sites that we know of. I mean, we know people were living on Orkney at the time. We don't know exactly where they were living because they weren't building these nice village sites yet, per se. And when those chambered cairns were first being built, but all of their settlements are built in a place where at least one, more often than not, 2 or 3 chambered tombs could see that settlement.
And what about the rings, like the stone circles?
So the stone circles, I mean, they're at the center of
they
Orkney.
related?
I mean, they really are at the center of Orkney, and they are a complex of sites. It is not individual sites. The relationships between the Ness of Brodgar on the Ness and Maes Howe and Stones of Stennis and Ray Brodgar and all that stuff, there's clear celestial alignments with them. There's clear kind of movement alignments along that peninsula between the two locks. But that's at the center of Orkney, and it was clearly a central kind of place for them.
Okay.
Looks like Madeline raised her hand. Go ahead, Madeline. Maybe not. Okay, well, I have a follow-up question on what you just said then. So when you say that the settlements are visible from the tombs, does that, is it something specific, like if you're standing on the tomb you can see the settlement, or is it even more specific, like it's visible from like the entrance to the tomb or something like that?
It is actually visible from the entrance of the tomb. To be specific, but I mean, most of my viewshed analysis side of it was just looking at whether or not it was visible from them initially. I could not all of the sites do we have where the entrance to the tomb is, because they're pretty limited. It's one of the issues that came up when I was doing my PhD. Initially, I was not doing a history of archaeology for my PhD. I was doing the big landscape analysis of Orkney, and the reason it changed was because there was a huge difference between what kind of data I could get on some of the sites and what kind of data I could get on others. So we knew that this was probably a Neolithic site, but it had never been excavated. It only been sort of vaguely recorded, and it was currently a pile of stones. Okay. And then we had sites that were excavated recently and had all this data, and trying to do a broad landscape study, I couldn't account for that data differentiation. I needed all of the sites to be at a relatively similar level, or at least a higher level of baseline, like not just knowing that there was a site there that we know very little about, to do kind of the level of kind of landscape analysis I wanted to. So it gets hard because there is only probably about 30% of the chambered tombs that we can tell exactly where the entrance is. 30-40% of the chambered tombs you can tell where the entrance is. So from those that I could tell, that was part of it.
I mean, that sounds like a good sample.
Yeah.
So the other question I had is, God, this is kind of weird. I guess the thing that I noticed is how many names came up from my undergrad, which was very interesting. And I guess, like, because I think you kind of established kind of this through line of people being interested in this place for a really long time. And so the question that I guess I have, and I think I'm phrasing it mostly in the sense, because like you kind of started with the 1500s and whatnot. Is the British Isles unique for this very early look at antiquities and consideration of, you know, historical sites, be it, you know, interpreted as mythic or, you know, related to biblical things, whatever they are? Is the British Isles unique for this? Were there other places in Europe where people were undertaking this kind of these types of investigations, these early types of investigations at that time?
So the British Isles are not necessarily unique in it. I mean, obviously, being English speaking, it's easier for us to access them. But the French and the Germans and the Scandinavians, to some extent Italians, but Italian archaeological history is very dominated by Romans and classical archaeology, whereas Germany and France and Scandinavia have a lot more similarities with Britain. So some of their histories are a lot more similar in terms of the broader context of histories of archaeology. Places like France and Germany were also producing similar kind of histories, and these kind of going around and checking out their historical sites and recording them in kind of inventory style records, and starting in like the 1500s. That shift kind of comes along with the Renaissance, the beginnings of kind of that Reformation period, all of that stuff. It all kind of shifts in there. I mean, part of why Henry VIII cared so much about doing all this, recording all of the sites and having this king's antiquary was because he then ended up using that to get money from them and sell off all of the monasteries when he went through the English Reformation. He used some of that data as for political leverage. So
that's
yeah. So just noting that there is a lot of complexity to understanding antiquities in, say, the 16th century, and the role of antiquarians and that side of stuff it's also intertwined with things like the Reformation and all of that, because the monasteries date back to the 12th and 11th centuries. So he was recording where the wealth was, as much as he was the kind of stuff that they had no idea how old it was.
Mm-hmm.
Part of that is they had no idea how old any of this was. All of it was within the last essentially 3,000 years for them. The Bible, Bishop Ussher hadn't even existed yet. He hadn't determined that it was 4004 BC yet. Like, they thought it was, anything that you could record back, which maybe 500, 1,000 BC. They weren't sure, but somewhere in there.
Mm.
So,
Chris,
yeah.
I finally got myself unmuted. It's Maddie.
Hey, Maddie.
My question was jumping way back in your talk when you mentioned the Picts and how mythological they seem to be, and in their costumes, etc. And I know they're a prehistoric people, so there's no written things really about them much, or they didn't write. What kind of decent research has been done on Picts? They always sound just legendary. I never seem to learn much about Picts as real people, maybe in the archaeological record.
There is actually a fair amount of archaeological research on the Picts.
Really?
Yes. I mean, they're basically an Iron Age Scottish group, and there is classical references to them that are relatively,
Real.
Yeah, I mean, as good as classical references to any group of people are. But I mean, those references exist from, around 200 AD to 800, 900 AD. You get classical references to the Picts. The Scandinavians, particularly in Orkney, show up in the 9th century. So you kind of lose the Picts in Orkney. But Anna Ritchie, who was one of the people I interviewed, most of her research was actually on the Picts. She's not a Neolithic specialist, generally speaking. The reason, the point of Buckaway is a Pictish site. It's an Iron Age site. And she initially was going there to study the Picts. And because they thought Skara Brae was a Pictish site before she showed up, they thought it was Iron Age. That's what Child had said it was. I mean, he started to change it later on, but, a lot of people still kind of thought some of these sites were actually Iron Age. So she got chosen to do the Napa Howard and some of these other sites because they thought it was Pictish, and they turned out to be Neolithic. But most of her research over her long career was on the Picts. So yes, you can.
And were they just totally lost, absorbed? I mean, is there any kind of Pictish remnant?
I would not be the one to answer that question. Okay. Unfortunately, the Picts are not necessarily my speciality. I know a bit. Someone just noted in the comments that they studied Pictish sites. There's a ton of interesting work on the Picts. And as far as I know, there's a ton of interesting work on the Picts. I just don't know most of it.
Okay.
Neil Sharples, who I also interviewed, he stopped doing Pictish stuff and switched to Iron Age stuff. So it's basically what you're looking for is Iron Age Scotland. And if you look at Iron Age Scotland, you'll get information on the Picts.
Thank you.
So.
Thanks.
Yep, no problem, Maddie.
Okay, I've got another one. And
Gretchen is raising her hand as well, I see.
Oh, okay, well, Gretchen can go first then.
Unless her hand's still raised from before.
It's an old race.
No,
It's an old race. Okay.
Okay, so I find it funny because the past 2 weeks could certainly be qualified as this, but I have a question about Nazis.
Okay.
And you mentioned the excavations that were taking place because of the war, and so that just made me wonder, is just like the damage to these sites, did it come because there was like infrastructure that was by a lot of these historical sites, or were fascists just being killjoys like usual?
So, I mean, the British public, in a broad sense, because there was a lot of damage from the Nazis bombing all over the UK, I mean, not just London, they bombed all over the UK, led to a bunch of sites being kind of quickly excavated as they kind of did reconstruction in Britain post-World War II. And that led to public recognition that there were all these sites, and led to a movement called the Rescue Archaeology movement. Rescue was the name of it. And that part of it is part of it. And Orkney specifically, part of it has to do with Orkney being a center for the military. It was the site for the North Atlantic Fleet during World War II because it had this great strategic harbor. If you go to Orkney now, you can see all these great gun emplacements all around the coast of Orkney to protect that North Atlantic Fleet that was based at Scapa Flow. So it's definitely part of what happened is they put in a bunch of infrastructure to protect the British Isles during it as well. So in Orkney, they were protecting it. Orkney didn't get really bombed during World War II. There were a couple subs that tried to peek into Scapa Flow to destroy it, and they were mostly sunk. They did manage to sink one boat, if I remember right, but my World War II history in Orkney is a little sketchy. But yeah, there is a lot of World War II infrastructure that was put in place, and in cross Britain, a bunch of areas were used for training and stuff. So Salisbury Plain, which is down by Stonehenge, was one of the major training grounds during World War II. And there's places where they drove tanks over barrows and stuff like that to mimic rough terrain in Europe and stuff like that. So they were going over monuments literally with tanks.
Okay.
One of the sites that's one of my favorite sites to visit, West Kennet Long Barrow by Avebury, which is kind of a big World Heritage Site near Stonehenge. There's a huge divot in it where they drove tanks over it during World War II as practice.
Okay.
So, hopefully, like, these are just things that happened.
Okay. Did the Nazis ever actually target cultural sites in the Blitz? I can't remember.
Not particularly. They were pretty indiscriminate during the Blitz. They basically bombed whatever they could. I mean, when Allison and I gave our presentation on Reed's Cavern, all of the archaeology that was excavated from Reed's Cavern in the 1920s was destroyed during bombing in Bristol because the museum in Bristol was bombed and everything burnt. So all of the materials recovered from it were destroyed for the most part. So it happened, and whole archives were lost during the bombings, particularly in London and Bristol and some of the other Manchester, some of the other big industrial cities that were the main targets of bombing by the Germans.
Yeah.
Hopefully that helps.
It does.
I see Katie wrote, "How long did this take me? I am overwhelmed." The presentation took me quite a bit of time over the last week or so to finish putting together. As I said, I had given this before, and it was also about equally too long. I'm sorry. I apologize for it going near as long as it did. I tried to cut it down. I clearly was not successful in cutting it all down. There's a lot of information. In some ways, I miraculously wrote my entire PhD in a matter of 6 months. Nothing that ended up in my PhD was written before 6 months before I submitted it. So the entire, like, 80,000 words that ended up in my PhD was written in a period of 6 months.
I think you were suffering from inertia.
It's a good thing you're
I-
wordy.
Really,
Nerdy.
the other thing is the difference between having a project that made sense to me and having a project that was just fighting me at every turn. So the project that ended up being my PhD, and it is available, you can read the PhD, it's on ResearchGate and Academia and on the University of Southampton website. It was what came out of me determining that I could not get what I had planned to do done. I started my PhD technically in 2011, but sort of in 2008. And all of the work that I did prior to that basically got thrown out, and all of it got written and researched in 6 months. So
That's intense.
it was a very intense 6 months.
Wait, but like all of the research that you did to get to that 6 months, like was that your entire career's worth basically?
No, most of that research happened within the year before I submitted, at least. Like nothing written before the final 6 months. Most of the research, almost all of the research, within the year before. So,
Well, good for you.
Really, literally nothing that I wrote before that got included in the PhD. I mean, I had written tens of thousands of words and chapters and all kinds of stuff. None of
So
it.
are you saving it for later?
I've saved I have all of it, and I do want to publish some of the stuff separately in separate articles and whatnot, but right now I work full time, and working full time does not give you much free time to do writing for publications.
You're not all gentry archaeologists? What?
Either does a baby.
Yeah. Yeah, a nearly 14-month-old does not also help for that when we don't have childcare in the middle of the pandemic, and he likes to help both mom and dad work when we're working from home. You know, he's adorable when he does it, but you know, typing on my computer when I'm writing reports is not ideal. Pounding the keyboard, not ideal.
Hey, I have a question.
Yeah,
Do you happen to know Douglas Pritchard?
I do not.
Oh, okay. I just took a class with him, and he works for ICOMOS and Historic Scotland. I
Okay.
think that's what it's called. And he did some of the 3D scanning and stuff for Scar Bray, I believe.
Okay, yeah,
So I
the recent
took a
3D
class from
scanning.
him.
So yeah.
Yeah, it was really cool.
Yes. The scanning they did it in Maze Howe and Scar Bray and all of the World Heritage sites, actually. Like there's a program for it. It was brilliant, and you can get some amazing like 3D imagery of all the World
Yeah,
Heritage sites.
I've seen some of the meshes that he has. It's pretty cool.
They're fantastic.
He does a lot of the shore stuff is what triggered me, is why I figured you might know of him, because he did a lot of the erosional studies using the digital stuff.
I've probably read some of his work, but he's not someone I actually know. I mean, that is the other challenge in there is Allison and I moved away from England in 2013, so I've been less plugged into the current community of archaeologists doing stuff than I would be when we lived there. It's an unfortunate reality of what happens when you move away. It's harder to stay plugged in. The older people are actually easier to stay plugged into. The people who've been around for a long time, the professors, the retired people, are easier to keep in touch with and plugged into because they're the same. They haven't changed.
Absolutely, and you run into them on formats like this, platforms like this.
Exactly. So.
Well, it's 9 o'clock Mountain Time, 11 p.m. Eastern Time. I think we should wrap it.
Okay.
All right. If you have other questions, you are always welcome to email me on stuff.
Where can people find you?
I hope you understand now how Orkney has influenced archaeology. If it has influenced archaeology, I don't know.
It influences a lot of books I have to read.
Yeah,
There you go.
what's the TLDR? Has it?
Yeah. That's the question. What do you guys think? Did it change archaeology?
I mean, I would have to say so because, yeah, like I said before, the sheer amount of people that I, encountered their work in graduate school, just seeing how much of a I guess a testing ground for a lot of pretty foundational ideas, I think. So I would agree.
There we go. Thank you, Christian. I'm glad my point came across. Despite way too much detail.
Colin Renfrew will always have a place in my heart.
Renfrew is awesome. Like, he is like one of the nicest guys ever, too. I mean, to be fair, Ian Hodder was also great to chat with. Like, he was totally willing and self-deprecating in the whole thing, and like, he made fun of himself on multiple occasions while talking to him. So,
hearing Ian Hodder make fun of himself must have been interesting.
it's quite entertaining. And he was really quite approachable and friendly about it. So,
Interesting.
And Hodder and Colin Renfrew is also super friendly and really nice. They're all really nice, easy to get a hold of and chat to. So sometimes people are a little bit afraid because they're like huge figures in the discipline, and they actually are pretty approachable and willing to just chat, which is nice. And listen to random students who are doing PhD projects about them and their past, and you're like, not sure I would want to say I'd participate in that if I was them, but
Well, you do have a point there.
There we go. So yeah.
Cool.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Hey, Chris.
Thanks so much, Chris.
You're very welcome.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
All right.
See you next month.
See you next month.
Thank you, Chris. Good night.